Hey, Estad.
Hey, thank you for coming. I really
Yeah,
appreciate this. I'm pumped for it.
yeah, okay. We're going to try to make Super Tuesday not feel so tepid.
Yes. Today is Super Tuesday. So people in 15 states and one territory are going to the polls. In Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, and American Samoa. Usually, it's one of the biggest days of the political calendar. But this year, there's nothing to indicate that it'll change the broader picture of the presidential race. That Trump and Biden are seemingly headed to a rematch. It's a day when a lot of people will make their voices heard. And there are also important down-ballot primaries happening, and races that could matter for control of the House, Senate, and governorships. So I called Amy Walter. She's the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report, which analyzes elections and campaigns. And she's someone I trust to help me understand what is worth paying attention to this Super Tuesday.
You know, I was thinking about it today of, all right, what am I going to be looking for in some of these states for the presidential contest? And look, I'm going to be looking in particular in some of these areas where Nikki Haley has been doing better, which is suburban areas around major metro areas or suburban areas that have been trending more Democratic in the last 8 years or so. So we know, for example, in South Carolina, where did she do best? She did best in and around Charleston and Hilton Head, where many of these voters may still be voting for Donald Trump, but they would like a different type of Republican, the kind of Republican they grew up with. What she's doing is highlighting the challenge Trump has long had, which is suburban white college-educated voters, especially women, are his real Achilles heel. And he has done nothing between 2020 and today to win them back. But that doesn't mean that he's going to lose more of them than he did in 2020. And that, to me, is the big question. It's not so much, is he going to lose many of these voters? Of course. But is it going to be worse than where he was 4 years ago? And that's the real issue, Estad, is that the primaries can't really tell us that. We're only going to know as we get, deeper into the election year and see if there are indeed Nikki Haley voters who were two-time Trump voters who say today, you know what? I just can't go a third round.
What about on the Democratic side? When you look at the landscape of either the early primaries that we've seen or the polling numbers that we've seen, I'm curious of what your kind of temperature check-ins on just how much trouble Biden is in, or is some of this a freak out with lack of evidence?
Right. There's definitely a reason to be worried or freaked out, whatever the term is, if you're in the Biden camp, because it's pretty clear that there is a significant group of voters who are not yet sold on Donald Trump, but who really aren't into Joe Biden either. These may be voters who voted against Trump in the last 2 elections, or maybe they're voters that haven't been particularly involved in politics yet. Maybe they were too young to vote in 2020, for example, but they just are not, even though they may not, as I said, vote for Trump, they're not voting for Biden. But the other piece, too, is that, one of the things that Biden had going for him in 2020 was this idea that for voters who identify themselves as independents or maybe more moderate centrist types, that he was going to be the better candidate for them. And now those voters, I mean, again, if you look at the polling, which I think right now is much too early, but he's not doing particularly well with independent voters. Trump is doing much, much better. There's clearly been erosion with voters of color, both Latino voters and Black voters. And so how real is that? How significant is that?
Yeah.
As I said, again, we can't know from these primaries alone, because I think so much of the erosion is among the kinds of voters who are not particularly engaged in politics.
Yep.
Certainly not this far out.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we hear this consistently. I remember when we talked to Nate Cohn, he made this point that the people that the evidence is pointing to that Biden is having the most trouble with, or could be the potential vulnerabilities for November, are simply a different group of people than who are deeply involved in primaries, particularly this primary, which seems even like less engaged than previous ones. We're simply talking about a different slice of the pie.
That's right.
I guess with that landscape, we really wanted to have you help us kind of understand the non-top of the ticket races and specifically look at some of the races that are happening on Super Tuesday. Can you give me a big picture on how things are shaping up when it comes to the race for House and Senate control?
Sure. We can start with the Senate because that's one where the math and the map really work against the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at just the number of seats that are up, Democrats have to defend 23 seats, Republicans just 10. But it's more than that. It's the kinds of seats they have to defend. So 3 of the seats of those 23 are states that Trump carried in 2020. So West Virginia, Ohio, Montana. Obviously, in West Virginia, Joe Manchin has announced that he's retiring.
Right.
That is a seat that Republicans are almost guaranteed to win.
Right. That's seen as an automatic clip for
That's
Republicans.
Right. That's right. So in a state that Trump carried by like 40 points, yeah, I think that's a pretty easy thing to say. But that also means that we should think about this election going into 2024, that the Senate is 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
And in that scenario, it means that if Trump wins, the Senate is already Republican. The only way the Senate stays Democratic is if Biden wins and they don't lose anything. They don't lose Montana, Ohio, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all of those states they have to defend. Now, I'm not saying they're going to lose all of those, but to say you've got to win every single one, you can't afford to lose any of those, that is a very, very difficult thing.
Democrats need to sweep both all of the competitive races and win the White House because the seat they're almost guaranteed to lose in West Virginia means we're almost inevitably looking at a 50-50 Senate in the best case scenario for Democrats.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the Senate. And on Super Tuesday, we're going to have an answer in a state that's not exactly on that competitive list, and that's California. This is primary that is really about the question of which kind of Democrat is going to come to Washington. Not so much will Republicans flip this state.
Right. We're not getting many of the answers to the D versus R in the primary season right now, but there are some states that are having kind of intra-competitive battles, one being California.
One being California, where the big question right now is, will the top 2 candidates, because this is how California's primary works, the 2 top vote getters go on to face each other in November. Will those top 2 vote getters be 2 Democrats, or will it be a Democrat and a Republican?
2 leading candidates for Senate, 2 very different visions for California. Steve Garvey, the leading Republican, is too conservative for California. He voted for Trump twice and supported Republicans for years, including far-right conservatives. Adam Schiff, the leading Democrat, defended democracy against Trump and the insurrectionists. He helped.
Right now, I think everybody agrees, and the polls say the same, that Adam Schiff, congressman from the Los Angeles area, is the front runner here and is pretty much guaranteed a spot in the runoff. The question is whether a Republican, Steve Garvey, for those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, remember him as the Los Angeles Dodgers star, baseball player.
I've decided to get off the bench, to suit up again, and get back in the game. And now for me, the ultimate challenge, to change your life for the better by being a U.S. Senator. Go to stevegarvey.com.
If you did not, then no, you probably don't know who he is. But as a child of the 80s, I do remember him. Or he will face, Schiff that is, will face Katie Porter from Orange County, who comes from the Elizabeth Warren wing of the party.
Washington, the U.S. Senate, drowning in Wall Street money and big pharma lobbyists. Katie Porter says enough. Time to shake the Senate up.
Schiff, of course, made his name with the impeachment proceedings, the very first impeachment of Donald Trump. And that helped him, in a state that is really expensive and really hard to get known. That got him a lot of name ID and also helped him raise a ton of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the House? How is the
Yeah.
race shaping up when it comes to control of the House in November?
That thing is just an absolute toss-up. I think the easiest way to think about it is Republicans have a 5-seat majority, and there are about 25 seats that we consider to be the most competitive, pretty evenly divided between the two parties. And so for Democrats to win, they need to win something like 65, 70-ish% of the closest races in order to just narrowly take control of the House. That's possible, but again, it's not like, oh, well, they only need 5 seats. How hard can that be? Just get 5, right?
We've seen so much of talk about the Republican slim majority, the amount of retirements, but and even Democrats feeling good at their prospects of the House. Right. But I hear you saying they still need to have a good election night to even get this narrowest of margins.
Exactly. They really do because, yes, they have a lot of targets, namely Republicans who sit in districts that Biden carried, but they've got their own vulnerable incumbents, some of whom sit in districts that Trump carried in 2020, and then redistricting in North Carolina, which basically drew 3 Democrats out of their seats. So the House is really a battle of inches more than anything else. It feels like we're playing a football game that is literally just between the end zone and the 5-yard line. It's literally who can grind their way to those few seats that they need to be in the majority, and, likely not a very big majority at that.
One thing that really comes through in our reporting is that people really don't like their options at the top of the ticket. If that's one big thing we hear, whether on the road or from listeners, it's why do we have these options? And that it bums them out about the prospects of voting in November. When we think about turnout for this year, or when we think about people's level of engagement or investment in the race, is there any signs about whether this was going to be a robustly participated election? Because in some ways, I feel like people are checked out, but I also think that, we had big engagement in 2022 and we had big engagement in 2020.
Right.
How should I weigh those things?
Gosh, I'm with you on that, Esteta. I'm very torn about that because you're right. On the one hand, if you just look at the data that says people are really dispirited with their choices, they are so disappointed in a Congress that it looks more and more dysfunctional every day. They are tuning out of the news. We're seeing more and more evidence of this. And so this idea of I don't want to participate.
Yeah.
But I don't know that that is really what's going on. And certainly by the time we get to November, because I think much like 2020, the stakes of the election for both sides are going to be very, very clear and be broadcast over and over again, that there are not subtle differences between these candidates. There are pretty significant differences between Joe Biden and Donald Trump and what their agenda will be for the next 4 years. So it seems to me that those things are going to be critically important. I mean, remember that, at this time in 2022, it was man, Democrats are going to get crushed in the midterms.
Yeah,
they
absolutely.
have no enthusiasm, right? No one wants to turn out. People are checked out. The economy's bad, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the Dobbs decision comes out and that changes everything. But even then, we couldn't really measure how important that issue of abortion was, in the sense that you still, in the polls, you would see people responding that, yes, the issue of abortion rights is important, but I'm really concerned about the economy. Or, yeah, I'm concerned about abortion rights, but I also think Biden's doing a terrible job. And so I think those cross currents are going to still, they're going to be there. And maybe we are living in a moment where voters are going to have to sort of adjust their expectations in terms of each of these elections is incredibly consequential, even if the candidates themselves are not appealing.
Yeah, I think you really helped us understand that phenomenon in 2022, you made a kind of specific reference to the type of voters who I remember you calling MEV voters, right? Like, I remember the explanation that some people can express displeasure with the president or express displeasure with the party and still actually come out. It's like hard for me to think that if we actually have an election where whether Donald Trump goes to jail or not is like basically up to whether he's president, that people are going to not care about that. Like, it's like hard for me to actually think that.
I agree completely. I've taken to using the Green Day song of Wake Me Up When September Ends as like my motto for this year. But I do think that's where a lot of voters are. Like, I'll check back in. Tell me when it's October and I'll check in.
You know, outside of the candidates who were, you know, as we're talking about, a lot of people don't find all that inspiring. What are the themes or policies or issues that you think are going to be what the election's about? Is there any hints, if you look at the Super Tuesday landscape or even some of the races that we've seen so far, about what are some of the defining themes that could really be where November is won or lost on?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the primaries don't give us a great insight into that. What I do think they tell us a lot about, though, is, especially on the Republican side, where so many of these primaries are happening, in states like North Carolina, where they redrew the map. And so we have a number of open, very Republican districts that will get a new member. And so you're seeing it there. And in some of these other states that have primaries, the top issue, which shouldn't be surprising to anybody who follows politics, is immigration.
I'm running for Congress because with Joe Biden's open border, the criminals walk right in.
I think every single ad that I've watched in every one of these races mentions immigration.
Yeah.
Joe Biden and Democrats have turned our border over to cartels and the woke left-wing mob.
America is crumbling and being invaded under Joe Biden.
Joe Biden broke our border, our economy, our spirits.
And I will fight for a secure border.
And then the next most popular term is Trump.
Bo Hines and President Trump will get us back on track.
Trump and Buckout. Together, they'll beat Sleepy Joe.
I'm standing with Addison McDowell, the only candidate in the race that's endorsed by Donald Trump.
Vote Sandy Smith and President Trump by March 5th to save America.
Biden must be stopped. I'm Sadie Smith.
Trump as an issue.
Trump as an issue, and Trump as an endorser, and Trump as I will stand with him, or my opponent hasn't been as supportive of Donald Trump. You know, thinking back to 2017 and what the Congress looked like, the Republican Congress looked like then, and what Donald Trump was sort of up against in terms of the quote unquote, now we think of it as the old guard of the Republican Party, but the more the pre-Trumpian Republican Party. Just in the last 6 years, that party has been completely transformed. And when I look at these primaries and the people who, again, they'll win these primaries, they're coming to Washington in November because their districts are so Republican. They won't have a serious challenge in November. They're going to look a lot more like Donald Trump. And if he wins re-election, it means that the Congress, there are very few speed bumps in the way that there were for him in 2017. So that makes for, you know, a Congress that is going to be much easier for Donald Trump to get not anything through, but he will have an easier time. Let's put it that way.
Or harder for a Joe Biden in the second term.
Well, that's another great way to think about it. Exactly. Which is the folks who are coming in right now are not running on, you know, what would be so great is if we did some more compromising. Let's work with the other side more.
Yeah. So let's look at some Super Tuesday specific races. You know, there's been some that we looked at. You mentioned North Carolina, the first district there. There's a couple in California 22, California 47, some of those places where the House races might be won or lost. There's some important governor's races. I'm thinking about North Carolina again, which has going to be what's a closely watched one. If you look at something that's, you know, going down literally today, as folks are listening to this, what would be a race that you point to and say, that's one to have my eye on?
Yeah, I am looking at the North Carolina district. It's the first district. This is a Democratic-held district, but it is very swingy and was made even a little bit tougher in redistricting. The candidate that comes out of that primary is going to matter a lot on the Republican side. the two-time losing candidate, her last name's Smith. If she wins there, that probably makes, again, it doesn't take it off the table, but it may give the Democrat there, the Democratic congressman there, a better opportunity to hold on than if he gets a new challenger who is not quite as burdened, let's say, with a lot of political problems like this former candidate. So, in other words, if we're talking about the House as being a battle of inches, then this is one of those inches there, right? I also like it instead. This is my East Coast bias showing because I don't have to stay up late. And then you pointed out the governor's race, which is also really interesting. You know, North Carolina is sort of like the Charlie in the football for Democrats. They come so close at the federal level and yet never seem to score that goal or that field goal or whatever.
What Georgia used to be for them. Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, the opportunity here for Republicans to pick up the governor's seat is pretty high. You know, you've had a Democratic governor for 2 terms. Again, you've got the legislature that is supermajority Republican. You've got 2 Republican senators. Right now, the polling suggests that while it's competitive, I saw a poll recently, he was right around 50%. And yet, Republicans are likely to nominate a candidate very, very far to the right, who will fit into that same category that we saw in 2022 with Carrie Lake from Arizona and the candidate in Pennsylvania who was very much to the right on social issues, cultural issues. And that's where this candidate, Mark Robinson, is on everything from abortion to gay rights to the Holocaust. I mean, it's pretty dramatic.
There's no reason anybody anywhere in America should be telling any child about transgenderism, homosexuality, any of that filth. And yes, I called it filth. And if you don't like it that I called it filth, come see me and I'll explain it to you.
This isn't just, this is a Trump-like candidate.
God formed me because he knew there was going to be a time when God's learning was going to be intolerable to the wicked. When children were going to be dragged down to go see the drag show.
You know, this has been the challenge in the era of Trump, right? Which is state parties or primary voters who want to see candidates who aren't, you know, necessarily built for a swing state. They want a candidate that's built for a red state who's going to be a fighter for values of, you know, cultural and otherwise conservative or Trump conservative voters. But that's not the state.
Yeah. I mean, the candidate you're referring to, Mark Robinson, is a good example of this type of phenomenon in the Trump era. As we had in 2022, there are candidates who have kind of fashioned themselves as the tell it like it is, straight shooter, grievance-driven, politically incorrect style MAGA candidates. And this guy's really at the top of the list. He is called the Holocaust hogwash in a Facebook post. He has, you know, been completely out of step even on issues like abortion and denying the last election. I mean, when you look at the landscape of Republican candidates, is it feeling as, I don't have a better word, as Trumpy as the 2022 slate was? I mean, that famously failed, right? Like, you would think that in a competitive race, like a North Carolina governor's race, like, we would not be back here with the same type of candidate.
Exactly. That you would say, I don't know, I kind of feel like we've seen this movie before. But it seems to me that that is not really, if the priority is the fight, then winning isn't necessarily what you're always aiming for.
Yeah, that's really
right.
Yeah,
the fight is what you want, and the fight is for something bigger and more, I guess, existential than just did we win this last election. And this, I think, it also speaks to this idea that the bubbleification maybe of our parties, right? That each of them are speaking only to the groups that they are most closely aligned with, as opposed to understanding that in a state that is purple, you got to be able to win over independent voters. You can't just get your base. It is fascinating, though, Estelle, because just as we discussed how close the race for the House will be, we pretty sure that the presidential race also going to come down to just like, a few thousand votes here and there. If you're always just a few thousand votes from winning, then it makes it really hard for you to take a good, honest look in the mirror and say, maybe we should change the way we do things, right? When
the polarization is such where if it's 49-51 every time, like it's hard to get that ship to change courses in each direction.
Because you say, well, next year it can be the other way around. We can get 50. And, the times when the parties have really sort of gotten themselves back on track is when they got walloped, right? Like losing election after election, and not just by like a point or two, but like, oh, hey, look at Democrats throughout the 80s and the presidential elections there where they were just getting wiped out. That's when you say, okay, what we're doing isn't working. But if we still live in an era where you're just constantly going back and forth about who has the White House and who has the House, and maybe the Senate is up for grabs here and there, well, it doesn't give you much incentive to change.
Mm-hmm. When people wake up on Wednesday morning, what should they be looking for? What should be the first place they look to on the map?
That's a very good question. I think what we will be curious to see is at the presidential level, did Donald Trump put numbers on the map, even in states and in places where a Nikki Haley on paper would do well? To me, what that suggests is that whatever energy there is or was for a Nikki Haley to keep up this fight, that has pretty much gone away. So I'll be curious to see that because, we have places like Massachusetts and Vermont and Virginia. So I'm here in Northern Virginia. I am very curious to see what turnout looks like here. This is a state that notably has been shifting more and more from even purple to blue. But what if Trump is doing really, really well here? To me, that suggests that, as I said, that whatever energy there was behind sort of sending a message to Trump or supporting Nikki Haley is gone. And then, as I said, I would like to think we'll have an answer in California for the Senate race. I don't know that we will. And in these House races, in these primaries, the kinds of candidates that came out is going to tell us a story of, were any of the candidates who did not style themselves in the House Freedom Caucus mold, or who were, say, backed by more quote unquote establishment types, make it through?
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Estelle.
That's it for this special Super Tuesday edition of The Run-Up. We'll be back on Thursday with a look at President Biden's campaign. The Run-Up is reported by me, Estelle Herndon, and produced by Elisa Gutierrez, Caitlin O'Keefe, and Anna Foley. It's edited by Rachel Dry, Lisa Tobin, and Franny Kartoff, with original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, Sophia Landman, and Alicia Be'itu. It was mixed by Sophia Landman and fact-checked by Caitlin Love. Special thanks to Paula Schumann, Sam Dolnick, Larissa Anderson, David Haufinger, Maddie Masiello, Mahima Chablani, and Jeffrey Miranda. Do you have a question about the 2024 election? Email us at therunup@nytimes.com. Or better yet, record your question using the voice memo app on your phone, and then send us the file. The email again is therunup@nytimes.com. And finally, if you like the show and want to get updates on latest episodes, follow our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, y'all.